Hello and welcome to the Ottawa Real Estate Market Update for November, everyone's favorite monthly YouTube series. My name is Andrea Madot and I am a proud member of the Papineau team here at Real, and I am what happens when you order a Serge Papineau off Wish.com. Serge is on a much-deserved family vacation, so he asked me to fill in for his monthly market update. Since I was feeling overconfident at the time, I agreed. Keeping in line with Professor Papineau's regular syllabus, we'll be covering the real estate stats for the month of October and discussing the government proposed changes to the LTB. Whether you're a tenant, landlord, investor, or casual observer of the housing market, you are going to want to buckle up for this one. But before we get into that, let's talk about how Ottawa's freehold and condo markets have fared in the past month, shall we? Starting with freehold, Ottawa saw 814 homes sell in October 2025. Comparing that to September, which had 741 sales, that's an increase of 9.9% month over month. October 2024 had 778 sales, so we're up 4.6% year over year. The average sale price for freeholds in October was $833. Comparing that to September, the average sale price was $790, so increase of 1.8%. October 2024, the average sale price was $770, so year over year, we saw an increase of 4.3% in the freehold sector. For condos, including high-rises and townhouses, there were 242 sales in October of this year. Comparing that to September, where there was 246, we had a month-over-month decrease of 1.6%, which is pretty minor. Looking at October 2024, where there was 262s, that's a substantial decrease of 7.6% year over year. October 2025, the average sale price in the condo market went up 3.3% from September and to $425,596 to October's $439. So comparing that with October 2024, the average sale price was $426. We saw an increase of 3.1% year over year. So with condos, the volume went down, but the sale prices went up. Is that due to inventory? I don't know. Go home, condos. You're drunk. But again, when it comes to condos right now, there are multiple different markets that exist within this property class. So I'm gonna reiterate what Sir Papineau noted back in August. If you are someone who'd like to own a downtown condo, now is a very good time to start shopping. Those buyers have a lot of bargaining power right now, and there are deals to be had. If you're someone who is selling a downtown condo, especially if it's your fairly typical 1 to 2 bedroom kind of cookie cutter unit, you have to be priced the best value out there, and you have to be patient. Moving on. So I went deep in our stats program. I wanted to see what the prices were like back in 2015. You remember October of this year, freeholds were averaging a sale price of approximately $804,000. Condos approximately $440. In October 2015, freeholds were $399,635. Condos $256,878. Wild, right? If you're thinking, how is that possible? Wasn't it just 2015 a minute ago? I know we all have selective amnesia during the COVID years, so it seems like a massive price increase, but 2015 was 10 years ago. 10. Just to hammer home how much has changed in the last decade, let me remind you, in 2015, humanity online as a collective debated the color of this dress. The most divisive event that entire year was whether this dress was blue and black or white and gold. Now, if you are too young to remember this international debate, firstly, it's blue and brown. Secondly, what the hell are you doing watching a YouTube channel about Ottawa real estate statistics? Go outside, enjoy your youth, get something pierced. Okay, lastly for stats, we have the months of inventory. Months of inventory, or MOI, is current active listings divided by previous months sold, which equals supply and demand expressed in a monthly metric. So if you, like me, are still suffering from the trauma of high school algebra, you probably just fully disassociated. So let's go over that again in a way my fellow right brain pals would process information. So if we took all the homes currently for sale without adding any new ones, we can use the previous month's trends to predict how many months it would take for every last house to be bought. Get it? Good. So now we know what months of inventory means, but why should we care? Great question. We have a widely agreed upon determinant of our market based on this MOI. 0 to 4 months of inventory indicates a seller's market, 4 to 6 is considered balanced, and anything over 6 months suggests that we are in a buyer's market. I calculated the MOI for October to be 3.78, so just shy of 4 months. This would imply we're in a seller's market, but at the higher end, creeping up towards balance, which makes sense because it definitely doesn't feel like a seller's market. But our perception of a seller's market has been pretty skewed from the pandemic. So now we are done with the stats. It's time to talk about the proposed changes to the Landlord and Tenant Board, or LTB. These changes are all part of Bill 60, the Fighting Delays Building Faster Act, released in late October, but not directly related to Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. Who is naming these bills? They all sound like run-on sentences. Anyway, within Bill 60, the Ontario government has made some intriguing proposals that would fundamentally change the rental landscape in Ontario. So if the intent is to fix a broken system, we need to understand how it was broken in the first place. So let's go back in time, close your eyes. Imagine yourself, it's February 2020, you're just going about your life, driving to your office every day, standing uncomfortably close to strangers at the grocery store, and probably washing your hands performatively only when someone else is watching. Suddenly, the world changes. You know what I'm talking about. We were all there. We know how the pandemic changed our lives fundamentally, but 5 years later, the fallout is still being felt in ways we never really prepared for. The rental market is a perfect example. So what happened? Well, tenants stopped paying rent. Not for a single reason. It was a convergence of economic, social, legal, psychological factors all at once. In short, tenants stopped paying rent during the pandemic because of the economic crisis. Eviction bans, mixed messaging, lack of coordinated relief, fear, uncertainty, social protest. But it wasn't really about defiance, it was more about survival and confusion, magnified by a structural weakness within the rental system. So let's elaborate on that. Firstly, there was the sudden income loss and job insecurity. Mass layoffs, reduced hours. When COVID-19 hit in March 2020, Ontario lost over 1 million jobs in a matter of weeks. Many renters worked in the hardest hit sectors like hospitality, retail, tourism, arts, etc., where incomes vanished overnight. CERB delays were uncertain. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, eventually replaced some income, but the rollout took time and eligibility was super confusing. Many tenants prioritized food and family needs over rent while waiting for these payments to come in. So gig workers and self-employed, also, these groups didn't often qualify for the immediate income support, leaving them unable to pay rent for several months. This resulted in a large share of tenants that simply could not pay. It's not that they didn't want to, but they couldn't. Next, we had the provincial eviction moratoria and the messaging of Ontario's emergency orders. In March 2020, the province suspended residential evictions, temporarily paused most, if not all, LTB hearings. The sheriffs were directed to not enforce any eviction orders. The messaging from the government, while well-intentioned, was no one will lose their home during COVID. This sort of unintentionally created the impression that rent payments could be deferred or fully forgiven. Meanwhile, at the same time, the federal government, through the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, allowed major banks to offer mortgage payment deferrals up to 6 months. Now, the eligibility varied by the lender, but generally it meant that borrowers had to be in good standing before the pandemic, no prior delinquencies, etc., but that they could, if they were a homeowner or occupied a home as an investment property, and they could prove that there was rental loss income due to COVID-19, they were able to get this deferral program, and on every mortgage if they had multiple on their primary residence and their rental property. So, as that's happening, the deferrals were approved case by case, not automatic. Some small landlords were denied if they couldn't demonstrate financial hardship or sufficient equity. But this caused public confusion and major resentment. The early headlines about mortgage relief created the impression that landlords were being bailed out while tenants were left to struggle on their own. In reality, the bank deferrals didn't compensate for missing rent. They just postponed the pain. But Tenant advocates argued that landlords received relief and tenants didn't. Landlords countered that theirs was debt accumulation, not assistance. So this communication gap contributed to misunderstandings across the board. It strained landlord-tenant relationships and it politicized the rent arrears issue. So as the evictions were paused, some tenants were interpreting these measures as a rent holiday, believing that they could catch up later or that their landlords couldn't legally demand payment until the restrictions were lifted anyways. So this resulted in a lot of tenants who could pay choosing to wait, assuming that there was leniency or future rent relief programs. So now we've got a lot of people just not paying. There was also a lack of clarity about the legal obligations. While eviction bans were heavily publicized, the province did not equally emphasize that rent was actually still owed. The LTB's closure created a perception vacuum. With hearings postponed indefinitely, tenants weren't facing consequences for non-payment. Landlords' hands were tied. They couldn't serve N4, the eviction, or obtain orders, which reinforced the idea that rent could safely just be deferred. Next, we also had the rising household debt and prioritization tenants faced through tough financial triage. Credit cards, groceries, utilities, childcare often took precedence over rent, obviously. Some renters used CERB funds to pay down other debts rather than rent, reasoning that eviction risk was low during the moratorium, so they took the money to pay down whatever else was necessary. This debt substitution effect left many months of rent arrears to accumulate. Next, we had structural vulnerabilities in the rental market. Even before COVID-19, roughly 45% of Ontario renters were already in core housing need, meaning they spent way more than 30% of their income on rent. The pandemic exposed this fragility when incomes dropped. There was zero buffer. The post-moratorium consequences when the LTB resumed in mid-2021, landlords flooded the tribunal with tens of thousands of L1 non-payment rent applications. Many tenants still owed 4 to 12 months of arrears that they couldn't repay them even after returning to work. So some tenants continued withholding rent as a form of protest against perceived unfairness in the pandemic policy, arguing that landlords received mortgage relief while tenants didn't. There was also the psychological dimension. The pandemic created widespread collective stress, fear, fatalism. Tenants who felt powerless or depressed often just disengaged entirely from bills and notices. The breakdown in social norms around payment, as in everybody's struggling, kind of eroded compliance altogether. Once arrears built up, many tenants lost their ability to, or motivation to even catch up. So I wanted to find a real world example, and if you know me, which you don't, you know I love reading CanLII, which is the Canadian Legal Information Institute. It publishes judicial cases, decisions ranging from criminal trials to the Law Society to the Landlord and Tenant Board. So I thought maybe I could find a case that would be a good example of the rental shit show. And literally, the first one I clicked on, which was posted at the end of October, it was priceless. So this case came out of Pembroke. It was published October 16th. The tenant had not paid rent, which was $700 a month, since September of 2021, all the way to August 2024. The landlord had been filing applications which were returned, being sent back, and it finally saw tribunal last month. By the time that they got there and the landlord was issuing the N4, the eviction, it was $32,000 in arrears that the tenant owed. Does that make you want to be a landlord? I didn't think so. And we often think of landlords as being these big, evil, capitalist tycoons, imagining them like Mr. Burns or Scrooge McDuck, Lord Farquhar, maybe? But sometimes they're just regular homeowners who, for reasons other than greed, became landlords. Maybe they bought a new home and couldn't sell their existing one, so they decided to rent it out. Maybe, like lots of folks in Ottawa, they were relocated for work, but wanted to keep their property here to move back to at the end of their posting. Maybe they owned a home, met a man online who also owned a home, fell in love, moved into his place, planned on selling, but ended up down a rabbit hole on social media where the algorithm and the TikTok girlies convinced her that he's probably a narcissist. So maybe it was best to just hold on to your home in case, hypothetically. Because the LTB has always leaned towards protecting tenants, it's become less and less desirable to be a landlord. But we have a housing crisis and we need more rentals, a lot of them. So is Bill 60 intended to encourage people to become landlords? Let's unpack that carefully. Firstly, the government's stated intent, according to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing in the October briefing, was, and I quote, "These proposed changes will make the Landlord and Tenant Board faster, fairer, and more efficient, giving small housing providers the confidence to stay in the market and encouraging more Ontarians to rent out properties." The phrasing here is really key. The government sees small housing providers, like mom and pop landlords, as a crucial source of rental supply that's been shrinking. And that's because of the LTB backlog and the rent recovery being so uncertain. And eviction enforcement was obviously very inconsistent. So many small landlords sold or left the rental market during the pandemic. So Bill 60 is meant to signal that Ontario is making it easier, quicker, and more predictable to resolve disputes. How does Bill 60 aim to rebuild landlord confidence? Well, the bill doesn't exactly hand out tax breaks or grants. It just changes the processes that have discouraged landlords from renting their units in the first place. Ontario's broader housing strategy links LTB reform to rental supply creation. The government estimates that small landlords, like those with 1 to 3 units, actually supply over 30% of Ontario's rental housing, which is huge. Surveys show that many sold their properties or converted them to short-term rentals because of the LTB delays and perceived tenant bias. So by speeding up dispute resolution, clarifying rules, the government hopes that some former landlords will re-enter the long-term rental market and new investors will feel confident building or buying secondary suites, basement apartments, or triplexes. So while the bill doesn't directly incentivize landlords financially, it's part of a confidence restoration strategy designed to keep small players in the rental system. Okay, finally get to those proposed changes. I'd like to go through the highlights of these proposals impartially before discussing which ones I have unilaterally decided are stupid. Caveat here though, this list is not exhaustive. It's just highlights. Number 1, remove ability to raise new issues on the day of a rent arrears hearing. So tenants will no longer be allowed to introduce new issues at the rent arrears eviction hearing unless they had given prior notice. So no new claims, no new evidence. Next, there's limit the number of new issues raised at the LTB unless 50% of the arrears have already been paid. This would amend the LTB rules so that when a landlord files a rent arrears application, a tenant wishing to raise new issues at the hearing, like maintenance concerns, would only be able to do so if they had already paid 50% of the rent arrears claimed in the landlord's application. The persistent late payment cases. Currently, the law allows a landlord to evict a tenant who has been persistently late paying rent, but the act does not define what persistently means. So how do you enforce that? The proposal would change that to allow the government to set a regulation that actually defines persistent in a matter of weeks or months. Again, pretty logical. Also, they propose to allow the government to prescribe the contents of notices and terminations, basically rewriting the forms to be easier to read and understand, which sounds like a pretty good idea to me. Next, there's the compensation requirements for landlords. Own use evictions. If a landlord wants to move back in, they have to compensate the tenant 1 month's rent for the eviction. So the government's proposing that if a landlord gives 120 days, 4 months, instead of the 60 to move back into the unit, they would no longer be required to pay the tenant that 1 month's rent compensation. If the notice is shorter, like 60 days, the old rules apply, which is kind of interesting. You can choose whether you want to pay them 1 month or give them extra notice. So they've also proposing to shorten the rent arrears eviction notice period. Right now, if a tenant misses rent, a landlord has to wait 2 weeks to serve the N4 before they can even file an eviction at the LTB. This proposal would shorten that to 7 days, 1 week, meaning landlords could start the process a week earlier and get the ball rolling. Lastly, we've got the lease agreement expiry alternative options proposal. So instead of a tenant automatically converting to a month-to-month arrangement after a fixed term ends, the landlord would now have the ability to dictate how and when the lease will terminate. For me, this is completely bonkers. So for clarity, currently, if a tenant signs the 1-year lease, at the end of that 1 year, their tenancy just automatically becomes month to month if they don't leave. They don't have to renew, renegotiate, etc. So what is being proposed here is to make that entirely up to the landlord. Imagine you're a tenant signing a lease and the landlord tells you from the outset that your 12-month lease will be just 12 months, and then you gotta go. I do understand the rationale here, but I fail to see how this benefits either party. I mean, I think it's fair to say that a tenant who views a rental unit as their potential long-term residence sees it as a home and treats it accordingly. Whereas offering an unextendable fixed-term lease, like virtually a short-term rental, tenants couldn't care less to maintain the property. Or there would be others that wouldn't even apply for the rental without a guaranteed 2 or 3 year lease up front. The change is so poorly thought out, it reminds me of those epic marketing fails that pop up every once in a while. Those ones that are just so cringy and tone deaf, you wonder out loud, like, how did this get approved? How did nobody stop this? So, not surprisingly, the backlash was swift and harsh. Most of that came from ACORN, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, which advocate for tenant rights. According to ACORN, approximately 23,000 emails criticizing this proposal were fired off to the Ford government immediately. So, government walked it back pretty quick, and it was announced that the government was no longer proceeding with planned consultations on potential changes to month-to-month leases. So they're not saying they're not doing it, but they're not saying they're not going to do it. So that's the highlights. We'll be watching how this bill makes it through consultation and what impact it will have. Thanks for watching.